And if you want to take it away.
All right, sounds great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for spending your Monday evening with us. We really appreciate it. Tonight is the first in a series of events that California is calling Policy Nerd Nights. In the Yang Gang, we love to sort of get into the nitty gritty of policy, and UBI is really at the core of many of the things we believe in. So we figured what better topic to start with. So we do have a Policy Nerd Nights working group led by Sean and Sarah, and they have done such an amazing job putting this panel together. And we are so excited for this event and all the future events. So, we're really pleased to see people from all over the United States here. And this is such an important and timely issue. I'm so glad that we were able to feature such amazing speakers and also have Tom from Nerds of Humanity moderate this panel for us. So make sure if you are in California to join the California Yang Gang Slack, and Sean will be putting a link to that Slack workspace in the chat. And that's where you can go to find out about California Yang Gang events, help us organize, get involved, learn about what we're doing. And also make sure to fill out, I believe there's going to be a survey after the event. So make sure to keep your eyes out for that. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. So excited to host the first Policy Nerds Night for California Yang Gang. My name's Tom. I'll be moderating this conversation. I also am the guy from Nerds for Humanity, which is a YouTube channel, and I volunteer for a new nonprofit called Of the People. But today we're going to talk about basic income, and we have two amazing guests. We have Max and Stacy, Max from the UBI Center and Stacy from the Income Movement Foundation. And why don't we start with just some quick introductions. We'll start with you, Stacy. Just tell the audience a little bit about who you are, and then we'll get into the discussion after Max goes as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Tom. And thanks, everyone, for the invitation and for making the space for these conversations. It's very cool to be here with you all. And I think I was down in California at different times during Andrew Yang's campaign, helping with a variety of things, and actually got to meet with the San Francisco Yang Gang as they were doing some work, kind of prepping for when Andrew had some campaign rallies there in San Francisco. So I see some familiar faces on here. I also see people that have just been involved in some of the work that we've been doing over the last year. Collectively as we try to get emergency UBI passed. So I'm Stacy Rutland. I'm founder of Income Movement. We're almost about a year and 3 months old. So kind of newborns in the nonprofit space. We specifically focus on grassroots organizing around getting universal basic income passed, a federal UBI passed. So we do grassroots organizing, and we also do coalition building across nonprofit organizations. So we do a lot of work with policy organizations. We aren't policy wonks by any stretch of the imagination. Max is definitely going to be able to go a lot deeper into some of the specifics on policy, but we do a lot of work with Economic Security Project, with Humanity Forward on some of the lobbying efforts, specifically right now under COVID, trying to get recurring cash payments, monthly stimulus checks passed. And so we've certainly been doing a lot more in the policy space because it's really kind of the call to action right now for all of us in this movement. I know I'm speaking to the preaching to the choir here. But yeah, so a lot of what we've been doing and focusing on right now has been grassroots organizing for the passage of legislation, COVID legislation, that will basically be an emergency UBI. So really happy to be here, happy to have conversations with everybody and answer questions that people might have, and to get down in the weeds with Max.
Thank you, Stacy. Max, an introduction to Max Geddes from the UBI Center.
Yeah, thanks again for also want to echo what Stacey said. It's great to see you all here and have such great turnout. I'm from California myself and pretty enthusiastic about UBI, so I'm definitely excited there's so many of you here as well. Yeah, so I run a group I founded called the UBI Center. We are a think tank that researches public policy around UBI. So, and really I came at this from a background of I worked in tech for a lot of my career, and through just general interest in UBI that was permeating through the UBI, through the tech community, as well as learning more about Give Directly and their nonprofit that does direct cash transfers. The whole evidence base behind cash transfers just became really apparent to me. And it's not too far a journey from that to realizing that there's a lot we do within our current welfare system that could be improved by UBI. And so I started getting involved in just the general communities, especially in the Bay Area. And I felt that there was kind of a piece missing. There was a lot of work on the grassroots stuff, which Stacey has really taken to a new level. And there were also some experiments and things like that, but there weren't as much studies from the kind of thing that you see, I think, for other kinds of policy proposals. So if there's a big tax bill, you'll see simulations of what that's going to look like for a bunch of different parts of the population. So basically, I left my tech job, went to grad school for economics, and created the UBI Center to fill in this gap. And so what we do is largely simulate different UBI policies, simulate different types of them, and look at different outcome metrics as a result. We also keep track of all the empirical studies going on in the broader research community that pertain to UBI. And now we have actually about a dozen research assistants from all over the world. So we're kind of a growing research team looking at things, everything from UBI policy in the US, state level kind of, I know we're going to talk about that later on. We've got a big UK community as well. The Lib Dem party over there endorsed UBI. So we're going to hopefully get involved in crafting what that could look like in the future. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about that and talk about what is generally happening in terms of economics of UBI.
All right. Well, welcome to both of you. This is going to be a great conversation. I think we're going to split up the dialogue into 3 parts. We'll start with just some kind of basics about what UBI is, why generally people are advocates of it. Then we'll get into some of the more common kind of follow-up questions that you typically get in these types of conversations. You know, inflation, motivation for work, how do you pay for it, that kind of thing. And then the third section will be about how people can get involved if they're interested in being part of the movement. And then lastly, we'll take some Q&A from the chat that the organizers will pull out from the chat as we discuss. So why don't we start with Stacey? What's kind of your opening summary of what UBI is when someone asks you, well, what is this basic income stuff? How do you try and explain it in a way that that folks get it?
I think we generally take kind of the humanitarian or humanist approach of what does it mean for us as a nation, as one of the wealthiest nations, to make a decision that everybody should start at that kind of basic income floor. I think it's been what's driven a lot, certainly in the last 40 or 50 years, a lot of the work in the basic income space has come specifically from the recognition that right now, the way our economic system is set up, it's not really designed to make sure that we are keeping our most kind of vulnerable and at-risk community members up to kind of par for what we think of what we think should be a basic quality of life and quality of income that from our perspective is what we should all be driving towards. You know, I think in many ways, Andy Stern's book, creating that the basic income floor, I think, is a really important, and it's been kind of the language that we use a lot around this. And I think that being able to have a conversation about where are we as a economic system, what are we doing with when it comes to working, and our ideas of what work looks like and how that's actually evolved over time, and then making sure that our policy around income actually addresses that, and making sure that that all of the work that's done that is of high value to our society is actually being given a monetary value, because money is how we work, but we definitely don't necessarily prioritize some of the most important people to our economy, whether it's people who are caregivers and aren't actually seeing any income at all, or it's people who are working 40, 60, 80 hours a week and still aren't able to make ends meet. So we generally talk about this as an opportunity for us to make a decision as a nation that we want to make sure that the way our wealth is distributed is such where we're recognizing the human dignity of each person, and that we're making sure that their most basic needs are met. And that's what a UBI is about.
Thank you, Stacy. Max, let me follow up on that with you. How would you respond if someone says, well, what Stacy discusses makes a ton of sense. People deserve, basic dignity and resources, but why not just provide that in the form of targeted programs? Why should it be in the form of cash, and why to everybody? Why not just to the people who need it the most?
Yeah, I think these are kind of the approaches we've taken with the welfare state in the US and in many countries to basically means test and also provide in-kind benefits. So I think those are the two differences from UBI. It's probably worth addressing them separately. We're learning today what the challenges and limitations of targeting are, because today we're trying to fill in the gaps of income loss due to COVID. And we're basically relying on two large sets of programs. One is unemployment benefits, and the other is trying to give direct cash transfers to low and middle income people. And the problem with unemployment benefits is they only reach actually a pretty small share of people who are in poverty. There's a lot of people who maybe they're low wage workers or they're out of the labor force who don't benefit from that kind of program. And this is true in the US as well as elsewhere. People outside the labor force are about half of the people in poverty. So we really need to reach those in some way. So you could think, okay, let's try to reach them with just unconditional payments that are means tested. And the problem there is we're looking back, the records we have in terms of income are from the last tax return in many cases. So that could be a year or two, even 2.5 years old if someone's kind of behind on their tax filing, and maybe it's a certain time of the year. So we're trying to target things based on data that doesn't represent current income for people, current living situations. And also, if you try to fix that, and this kind of feeds into what the Biden team is trying to do with the child allowance, they're trying to make this a monthly program and ensure that if people fall with their income, if they're newly eligible because it's a targeted program, that there's some way for them to document that and get the benefit when they wouldn't otherwise. And this just creates a lot of complexity. It's a lot of extra overhead for the government to fund those kinds of mechanisms. And it's hard for individuals to comply with those kind of things. If you're, imagine how healthcare.gov rolled out. It wasn't like a stunning success necessarily. It's a lot better now. But if you're trying to encourage people to document every income change, if you're an Uber driver, right, your income's pretty volatile, and there's a lot of people with volatile incomes who don't really know what they should put in there. So I think there are actually just mechanical problems with targeting that are pretty difficult to fundamentally overcome. We don't have a time machine where we can go back and say, okay, here's our the benefit we should give you based on exactly the data we know about you at a certain time. And then on the in-kind benefit side, there is just so much evidence that people use cash effectively to meet the needs of their families. If you look at for example, cash transfer experiments, especially if they're given to parents of kids, those have lifelong benefits for those kids. So in most cases, parents are not abusing that money. We also see this even with homelessness. There was a study in Canada. If you give cash to people experiencing homelessness, they get out of homelessness faster too, if they're adults or anything like that. So we're seeing just more and more that poverty, the absence of cash, is really what's driving a lot of these problems. And there's just not a need to constrain people's spending to ensure they can't buy hot food with food stamps, or they can't live where they want if they have housing assistance. And all of these things also add to the cost of the programs, not just for the government. And in many cases, it's 10% overhead that we're spending as taxpayers to prevent people from just doing what they want with the money. And it's a huge time suck for people who are trying to apply. So I think those are some of the concerns.
Let me follow up with you on that, Max, and then we'll get Stacy in as well. I get the argument about the Uber driver or maybe the caretaker at home. But what about the person who's making $500,000 a year? Like, why give that person anything?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to how you fund it. And there's basically no way to fund a UBI. You have to get really creative. I'm sure it's possible, but in a way that the person earning $500,000 a year doesn't come out behind. Because even if you have a very regressive tax, that's not going to treat someone earning 500K at the same. You have to basically have a head tax, which is taxing people in proportion to just how many people there are. So if you have a VAT, yeah, someone mentioned that in the chat, someone earning 500K is going to pay a lot more in a VAT because they have so much more spending that they're doing, and also their investments are hit by the VAT, all those kinds of things. So I think it's just kind of penny wise, pound foolish to try to target people on the benefit side. We have a very robust system for collecting money from rich people, and that's the tax system. We can just rely on that.
Thanks, Max. I appreciate it.
Well, and just to add to that, I think that it's if we actually just look at the percentage of our populations that fall into different income brackets, the number of people who are making 500,000, upwards of 500,000 and more, percentage-wise, this is a significantly smaller percentage-wise than almost everybody that falls below that, right? We're talking about, it's not quite the 1%ers, but it's pretty close, right? And so I guess to me, I feel like we've seen, a lot of what Max is talking about as far as what we've seen around unemployment and the first stimulus checks. Right now we are in a devastating time. And we're also in a time where there's a large amount of data that's being generated about what is effective, how cash transfers can work, and the problematic natures of targeting, just like Max was talking about. I think, that $1,200, the first $1,200 stimulus check, and then the $600 one that came, whatever it was, 9 months later, there was a lot of learnings just from that first $1,200 check of realizing that when they did targeting, they actually left a lot of people out that they hadn't intended, but that had been left out, some of the most at risk and at need, right? And so there was a lot of work being done on the policy side around how do we make sure that we rectify the problems of the first $1,200 check and who we were targeting, so that more people that we know need it get it. And the more you go down that line, I think we saw it with the 600. We also are seeing it now with the $1.9 trillion bill that Biden-Harris is pulling forward. I think there's a lot of conversations on the Hill about how, if we're going to continue to target it, is the way that we're targeting things actually effective? And pretty consistently, they're not. Through targeting, they're losing more and more people kind of through the filtering process than they think that they're going to. And so if we're really trying to design something that takes care of the people that need it most, the way that we have seen the most success with that is untargeted. Just give it to people and make it as flat and easy of a kind of gate system as possible. And then if you have a certain percentage of the population that doesn't need it, the tax, I mean, you know, people talk about this all the time. I think the term that people use often is like claw it back in taxes next tax season. There's lots of ways to make sure that that $12,000 or whatever it is, that's, you know, if it's $1,000 a month, that can go back into the coffers for people who don't need it. But it's far more detrimental to our society and to the people who need it most when you start putting those kinds of restrictions in place. I mean, it's almost impossible to design a targeted system that has more than one or two different mechanisms or kind of requirements that you must meet before you just start to lose people. And then you have all the administrative costs that are associated with that. All, you know, if there's just, you create such a level of burden on the state to manage that you just lose the intent, which is to help people. So like, let's help people.
Just to add a couple numbers there. For example, the Earned Income Tax Credit is a program, it's one of the biggest anti-poverty programs. Child tax credit also is pretty large. And these programs, because they're through the tax code, they're about 1 in 5 people who are eligible for them do not get them. So similarly for food stamps or housing assistance, lots of these programs have large share of people who are eligible but do not end up getting the money. And that's because they're targeted. So if you compare that to something like Social Security, there's a pretty strong PR campaign, or you barely need it really, because everyone knows about this program. So basically nobody falls through the cracks of these more universalist kinds of programs because they're just so widely known. And this is a broader problem, I think, with the welfare state is a lot of these targeted programs, very few people really know how they work. They don't understand how much effort it takes to comply, how really they discourage work in so many ways because they're so hidden from view. So universality fixes that.
Thanks. Now let's talk about another common question, which is maybe you hear this from folks you talk to, Stacy, when you try and advocate. Won't this disincentivize work? And isn't this a country that was built on people rolling up their sleeves and, you know, they get the mule and they go west and they make a life for themselves and they didn't get the government writing any checks for anybody? How do you respond to the concerns about people just kind of hanging out playing video games?
So generally my conversation around, besides, I mean, the first place to go to is the data, and the data actually does not bear that out. Not any, you know, the data that's come out of the pilots, the data that's even come out of some of the even just like 1 time or, you know, two months, like they can be very short amounts of time that somebody's receiving a direct cash transfer. And what you see happen actually is the complete opposite. You see people actually increasing their income as a result, not just because of the basic income that they're receiving, but because they've been given a little bit of breathing room to maybe apply for the job that they want to have, not the one that they need to have. There's a wide variety of data points, but to me, I think data fundamentally, we're talking about a philosophy around how we think people need to function and how our society functions best. Before founding Income Movement, I founded a user experience product design company, and we did work for many Fortune 500 companies, and worked really closely with a lot of different large corporations. And what I'm here to tell you is about 15% of people working at large corporations are totally phoning it in. They're shuffling papers, like it's just common. And when you look at how corporations actually work their budgets, they expect a certain low level of productivity by a certain percentage of their employees. We actually have this built into what we consider our most effective models for economic systems. It's what happens when you get to a large number of people. When you start to get into hundreds of thousands, millions of people, there's always going to be a few people who take advantage of the system. Those people usually are a very small percentage. And do we want to make a decision when we're talking about UBI, if we're talking about the 128 million people who are living in economic precarity, if we want to throw out helping 132 million people because 4 million people might take advantage of the system, I think that's morally and ethically a conversation that we should be having as a society. It doesn't make sense to me when I think of all the families, all the children who need this, who would not only work, but work more effectively, maybe be able to spend more time with their kids because they only have to work 40 or 50 hours a week instead of 70 or 80 hours a week. Like the overall health of our kids, the improvements in education outcomes, like all across the board, health outcomes, what we know statistically happens when people are not stressed about their money and living on that edge of worrying about their kid breaking their leg when they're playing football because they're not going to be able to afford to pay the out of pocket that is required for that, and the kind of domino effect of what happens to people that are living in that precarity. To me, I have that conversation with people, and it's actually quite interesting when we start to talk about it in those terms, especially people who are more conservative, who throw that out there. As soon as I start talking about corporate models and how and what that looks like, almost everybody that's worked at a corporation, when I have that conversation with them, they're like, oh yeah, that's actually totally true. You're working on a team of 20 people, 2 or 3 of those people, they're not going to be productive at all. Like they're just phoning it in. And that's a bummer in the moment to be working with those people. And also Intel, Apple, they're still all highly successful corporations. We can still have a highly successful model and have a few people take advantage of it. And I suspect that even the people who when you start to talk about who takes advantage of it, we have a lot of different ideas about who's taking advantage. I don't think an artist is taking advantage of it if they decide to do more work on their art. I don't think that a mom is taking advantage of it by deciding to not go back to work as early as she would have had to, but in another situation. So I think it's an interesting conversation to have when you get it on the philosophical side and kind of the moral and ethical side, because it's actually pretty hard to say, yeah, I want to screw over those 40 million kids because I'm worried about, some 20-year-old stoners playing video games in their basement. I don't know. It's a deeply problematic road to go down, I think. I think it's immoral, and I think people start to realize it when you have conversations like that with them.
Yeah, it's also a bit of a interesting double standard in that we know the existing programs are far from perfect, and there's plenty of waste and abuse on existing programs. So it's strange that a new initiative has to pass like this 100-point check, and it has to be perfect in every way before, some people take it more seriously. Max, have you seen data around impact on employment or people's, likelihood of working or, to kind of address some of these concerns?
Yeah, I guess first, I think from a philosophical perspective, I don't see it as abusing the system when people retire because they have enough income. Or I think people don't abuse the system even if they're responding to the incentives today that encourage them, because these welfare programs phase out so quickly with income. A lot of people, it just doesn't pay for them to get a job. And I think many of us, if we were choosing between spending time with our kids or going to work and having less money to take home because we have to pay taxes, as well as we lose our housing benefit, we lose our food stamps, we lose our TANF, our cash welfare programs. So yeah, I just don't think the language around people abusing systems is helpful. People respond to incentives, and we have to make the incentives work effectively for them. And yeah, there's, as Stacy mentioned, there's a number of studies that show, especially in developing countries, that cash transfers increase earnings later on. I don't think those are super translatable to the US context, because what's happening there in most cases is people are entrepreneurs. Basically, all extremely poor people in the world are entrepreneurs, quote unquote, because they don't have access to a real job market. So these are people in rural Kenya, they're basically farmers or something like that. So they need some money for investment in their business. If you compare that to what happened in the US, where you have maybe low to middle income people who are getting money, they're probably, to the extent they're employed, they're not running their own business. They're probably employees with some firm. And there we see, for example, reviews from the Congressional Budget Office find that there is what's called an income effect. If people have more income, they do reduce their work, their labor supply, but it's pretty small. It's about, for every 1% increase in income, they expect that people reduce their labor supply by 0.05%. And that's like hours worked. So you compare that to the other half of the labor supply concept, which is called the substitution effect. And that's basically how much people respond to the taxes that they pay. If you're going to face higher marginal tax rates, you're going to work less because it's not as valuable to you. You don't get as much consumption from that income or that labor you provide. So there, that's really a dominant factor. It's much bigger than the income effect. And that suggests that the way we design the taxes that fund the UBI are actually much more important than the UBI itself in terms of explaining what kind of labor supply effect we can expect. And in particular, there's a big opportunity to do reforms to the existing welfare system that remove some of these very rapid phase outs. Lots of people facing marginal tax rates above 80% or even 100%. There's no rich person that faces anything like that. The poor face some of the highest taxes in the country because of these overlapping means-tested programs. So if we can reform that, we can make it more progressive and ensure that the taxes needed to fill the rest of the UBI budget hole, we can actually make the labor supply effects pretty modest.
I'll just add that that Mayors for Guaranteed Income has data that's coming out. Magnolia Mothers Trust, another pilot, has data that's coming out fairly soon. And then Steady, which is an app that that has actually given, has done a few different pilots and also given several $1 million worth of just direct cash grants, one-time cash grants. They actually do bear out that 3 to 6 months later, people who received even short-term 1 to 3 payments actually are making 6 months later, 12 months later, 18 to 25% more money because of what they were able to do when they had that money to make decisions about how to try to make a good move to either another job, to improve some skills, whatever it is that they did with that little amount of money. So I think that it's actually, I don't think it's as obvious and maybe as good of a story as what happens from Give Directly and other organizations that are doing cash grants and cash, direct cash systems in developing nations. But I actually think that this year we're going to start to see, because of all of the different pilots that have been run in the last 18 to 24 months, we're actually going to start to see a lot of data come out that does make the point specifically that people not only continue to work, but they actually become better income earners over time by having this additional component of income in their lives. So
I think we do need to be careful about, I'm not sure a lot of those have control groups, for example. So these aren't really, there's a lot of data. I think in some cases we're assuming that UBI is unlike any other policy. And there actually are a lot of studies that show what these parameters of labor supply elasticities are that we can look to. Hopefully more of these UBI pilots can provide more information. but I do worry about using some of these really observational impacts.
Well, seed is.
Yeah, seed definitely has a control group, but they haven't.
And Steady used the same control. Was working with the organization, was working with the researchers at the center of UPenn to make sure that they were doing a control group the same, with the same mechanisms that seed was run under as well. So I think that I'm excited about this year as a year of getting the data out there, data that's also accruing because the same data sets are getting utilized across a lot of these pilots. So we're actually growing a larger and larger data set, even though they're kind of smaller, they feel a little bit small and kind of piecemeal by using the same data sets. We're actually starting to see some consistencies as those ends get higher and higher with each new pilot. So it's very exciting. And for sure, I think by June or the end of this year, I think we're going to start to have a much clearer sense of what the impact on work and income is of these pilots.
All right. Well, let's move on to another common question, which is massive inflation. That the moment basic income is introduced, your landlord's going to say your rent just went up $1,000, or everybody's going to charge you more, and so it won't really be that beneficial. Stacy, you want to start, and then we'll get Max's thoughts?
Well, I'm definitely interested in hearing Max's thoughts on this. I think the argument or conversation about are burgers going to cost more, and is the box of cornflakes going to cost more? I think that is less of an issue. I think the market and the way that the market works, you're going to be able to limit that. I think that when it comes to something like rent, though, I think we actually need to have a real conversation around that component. I think that actually is one of the areas. I mean, Andrew Yang during his presidency, talked a lot about like the three things that where we've had hyperinflation and that have gotten kind of out of control: education, healthcare, and housing. And I think that the housing component in particular is one where we would need to be passing some kind of legislation, really probably at the local level, because most of that happens at the local level, where you are limiting the amounts of rent increases that landlords can do in a year and things like that. There's a lot of cities that have already instituted that. Here in Portland, they've been pretty intentional about trying to make sure that because we were having such a crazy kind of housing spike in the last 5 years, trying to make sure that that the amount that rent can increase is capped at a certain percentage, and that that renters are kind of protected from being kind of forced out of, and kind of in really what can happen, that we've seen with gentrification. Like we can just see some of that same kind of behavior happen, even with a UBI, just as far as making it more and more difficult for people to live in urban areas and kind of getting pushed out of the cities, out of their neighborhoods. So I think that it's an important component. I don't think that I would be worried if any elected official who wanted to pass a basic income didn't feel like there needed to be some real work on the housing side of this.
Max, what do you think?
Well, I agree with that last part for sure. I think there is a need to address housing affordability, whether there's UBI or not. It's probably the biggest, cost that is really a preventable problem. And this is sort of on the side. I'm pretty involved in housing stuff as well. So, there's a lot of these zoning regulations that prevent the development of apartments in urban areas. So if we just start legalizing apartments again, as they were legal up till the 70s, we could have the supply of housing match the demand, and we would see a lot lower housing costs in general. So I think on the general inflation UBI side, there's a theoretical from an economic perspective argument, and then there's actually a few studies which I'll share. So on the theoretical side, in general, as you're putting more money into the economy, that will probably increase inflation. But this is why really the way you fund it makes a big difference. If you have a budget neutral UBI policy, then that is just kind of redistributing purchasing power between people. So that really shouldn't change the inflation rate much. Some things that also don't really help, there's evidence that price controls like rent control does also, that basically increases the cost of housing for people who are newly moving into housing. So that's not generally seen as a very effective policy, whereas increasing the supply would be. There actually have been studies on UBI and inflation too. So there was a cash transfer program in Mexico where there were two arms effectively in an experiment. Some villages got food assistance directly and some got cash. And they found that in general, the cash villages did not experience much price differences compared to the food arm, except if it was a very rural, very remote area where there was maybe just one food producer or food vendor. In that case, they were able to raise their prices more. So this also goes toward the idea that having competitive markets, and that means having dense cities, places where people have multiple options in terms of their consumption, that can really offset some of these inflation tendencies. Give Directly, the nonprofit, also did an experiment in Kenya, and they dropped cash on randomly chosen villages as well, and they actually saw no inflation as a result. So that is another good use case. And also there was a simulation model in UBI in New York City. So this wasn't a real program, but some macroeconomists basically simulated what happens to the overall economy when you have a UBI that's funded by income tax. And they found that actually rents would fall because demand for housing falls, because the people who are more rich, who would be hit by the income tax, would want to move out of the city. So again, comes back to, it really matters how you structure the overall policy and ensure that the rest of the economy, I think whether you have UBI or not, you need to have markets that are functional, and housing markets are just not functional right now.
Well, let's get into how we pay for it. I've heard a few different approaches, and I'd be curious to get, maybe Stacy, will start with your thoughts. I've heard one approach, which is the Yang 2020 value-added tax approach. I've heard a wealth tax approach. I've heard from libertarians just cutting existing in-kind programs and turning them into cash. Would love to get your thoughts on how you think it would best be funded.
Well, I don't think cutting existing programs, I guess I can just get that off the table in my mind. I mean, what my hope for existing programs, what would happen is after a basic income is passed, that those programs turn more to cash, direct cash, instead of these very targeted and siloed benefits. So in my mind, this isn't replacing, basic income wouldn't be replacing any of those things. I would hope over time it would influence food stamps and, and housing vouchers and things like that to actually just be an additional cash on top of basic income. To me, seems like the most appropriate. So that's not where I think we should be getting the money from. I think we should be, I don't go deep into policy because that part is part where Economic Security Project and some others have been doing a lot of work in that space. And we partner with them to understand kind of where their years and years of work in that space has taken them. But I think that from our perspective, a wealth tax makes, at this stage, a wealth tax and corporate tax makes a lot of sense. from our perspective and thinking about like wealth redistribution as at least a component or large component of funding it is an important direction for us to go, I think, as a country. But I'll hand it over to Max to talk about that and all of that, because I know he's done a lot of work specifically on funding mechanisms.
Yeah, I think the important part on funding is just to recognize that UBI it is extremely expensive. I mean, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves. We're going to need a lot of revenue, which means we're going to need funding sources that have broad bases. So if you think about a tax that's just on cigarettes or something, that's going to have a very narrow base compared to a VAT, which taxes the entire consumption economy, or it depends on how it's structured, but a lot more of the economy. So I think a VAT is actually a pretty good solution because it can raise so much. Flat income taxes as well can raise a lot. Once you start having very progressive income taxes, like what AOC was talking about with over $10 million, 70%, that just does not raise very much revenue. It's only, I think it's less than 100 billion a year that would raise, well under 100 billion. And even a wealth tax, Sanders had probably the most extreme wealth tax, and that would probably only raise 3 to 4 trillion over a decade. You need something closer to 30 trillion to fund the kind of UBI we're thinking about. And corporate taxes as well, unfortunately, they are very elastic. Corporations can kind of move anywhere in the world. So there's a ceiling on how much we can raise from a corporate tax. It's also just a less efficient, like economists can rank different taxes in terms of how much economic growth they reduce. VATs are pretty efficient, dollar for dollar. Income tax is probably below that, and then corporate taxes might be below that as well as wealth taxes. I do also think we should consider using other programs. If we're thinking about UBI eventually replacing SNAP, well, I think we can think about that from the get-go as well. What really matters is, are we reducing poverty or not? And it's basically impossible to design a UBI policy that doesn't reduce poverty. The important thing is just that we can raise enough to have as broad a transfer as possible. We've actually done some research on this at the UBI Center. We did some simulations of what happens if we replace our current tax system. We didn't look at the benefit side, but just the tax system with a flat income tax. How much would you have to raise and basically use a surplus from that flat income tax to fund the UBI? You get basically an 18% flat tax will fund a UBI, the federal government with no UBI. So anything above 18%, you're now generating revenue for a UBI. And as long as you have a tax that's at least 23%, it's pretty modest. You now have had enough of a UBI to reduce poverty and reduce inequality compared to today. So if we had something like a 30%, 40% flat income tax, that could really reduce poverty and inequality pretty substantially. And also, a lot of these programs, if we funneled the money into that, we wouldn't just be making the program more generous for everyone, but we'd also be removing a lot of the work requirements that accompany these programs, a lot of the really severe phase-out rates that these programs have. Again, people experiencing 80% plus marginal tax rates. We can make sure that people have a fair, transparent tax and benefit system. But I think sometimes we shouldn't be too attached, in my view, to what we happen to have today.
Great. Let me build on this a little bit, in that I think we're establishing, and we all agree, that UBI would be a very expensive program. It would cost a significant amount of money. And there are other things that we could spend money on. There was talk in the 2020 campaign of a federal jobs guarantee, a Green New Deal, baby bonds, like expanding the current welfare programs. How do you think you evaluate alternative uses of that money, and why do you think basic income would be a better way to spend it than some other very ambitious and well-intended initiatives? Stacy?
Well, I think that it's an important, I don't think that we need to necessarily think of this as either or, right? I think that we should have, I think that we should be dumping a lot of money into a green economy and the infrastructure that is needed for us to actually start to do the work for that's absolutely critical right now as a human species, for us to start thinking about how do we function more effectively as a country and as a world, as a species. So I don't think that I wouldn't say that we should do UBI and we shouldn't do something effective to Green New Deal or some version of that where we're building massive infrastructure. I think that we can have, I think that there's certainly in the near term a lot of jobs that could be created in order for us to be able to get where we need to get to when it comes to being more effective with climate change. Now, in the long term, is that going to be the case? Are we going to have enough jobs out there for every single person to have a job by the way that we define it today, employment? I don't know that we even necessarily have that as our goal as a country, to have every single person working a 40-hour a work job, right? I think that if we start to think about what is it that we need to do as a country, we know that we need to build infrastructure. We need to be doing a significant number of things that we're not. And at the same time, I think a basic income is an important immediate first step, right? A lot of the things that you're talking about there are longer term efforts. They take a longer period of time to implement. And things like $15 an hour minimum wage, which I totally support. They also can impact different sizes of companies and businesses as well. I do think that the idea of being able to, what we've seen with the $1,200 stimulus and then $600 stimulus check, what we're seeing is that it's actually very quick and easy for the government to distribute a large number of checks to a new group of people, right? We've seen it with Social Security, and to be able to see that there's a mechanism to do that very quickly and effectively, from our perspective, means that this really is the way to get the most support to the most people in the shortest amount of time. So if we really are talking about being able to help and infuse our society with the income, with the money that's needed for everybody to be able to have their most basic needs met, things like jobs guarantee, it takes a long time to get those things up and running. It's a lot of training, it's a lot of administrative costs, it's a lot of things that are going into all of those programs that end up meaning that you're putting money not into people's hands, but into programs and policy and administrative kind of processes that from our perspective is going in the wrong direction. You give the money to people because what we're talking about is making sure that everyone has their basic needs met. You can do that, and you can also be doing infrastructure building, Green New Deal kind of elements to make it so that we're increasing the high-skilled, higher-paid jobs that we need, so we're not further moving towards the service industry and kinds of jobs where you have these huge swings like Max was talking about earlier. where you don't necessarily know where your next check is going to come from or how much is going to be in that check, because maybe you didn't get as many rides as a Uber driver, or didn't get as many whatever it might be that is kind of the gig economy working experience right now. So better paying jobs are important, and they should be absolutely a priority. And we also need to be doing basic income.
Yeah, I guess, sorry. I can respond. I mean, yeah, maybe I'm more of a UBI extremist than Stacy, because I think we're kind of kidding ourselves if we're not thinking that these are in competition. A Green New Deal, the central component of the Green New Deal is a federal job guarantee. And that's just a totally antithetical policy to UBI. It says that it's basically, I think, I like what Matt Brunig, who's actually a socialist, the way he talks about federal job guarantee is it's unemployment benefits with a work requirement. And I totally believe that that's true. We are against work requirements. I think UBI is fundamentally about making sure that there aren't requirements, that it's not something that's in kind, but really half of it at least is the fact that people get it regardless of what they do. And I'm worried about, if Trump took office and we had a job guarantee, he would have sent everyone to build a wall, right? And you don't get your benefits unless you build the wall. So I do think we are in competition, and this is the way other programs think of it too. When they hear about UBI, they think we need to spend money on this other program that I advocate for instead of UBI. So I do think we need, I'm not on the politics side. I'm just a think tank guy, but I think we need to stick up for the merits of UBI compared to these other programs. And if you think about other welfare programs that have work requirements, that's EITC, it could be TANF, SNAP. Really almost every program has some sort of work requirement. Baby bonds don't have a work requirement, but they also don't help kids when they need it most. Baby bond is, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's the idea that you seed a savings account with every infant once they're born from the government, and that amount depends on the income of the family. And then they keep building into it until they're 18, and then the 18-year-old gets to have a big chunk of change, which they can only use for home ownership, for entrepreneurship, or for education. So it's really an in-kind benefit. It's kind of like a child allowance, except it doesn't actually help kids when they need it most. There's so much evidence for giving cash to kids, and baby bonds kind of throw all that value into the ocean. So yeah, I think especially if we're looking at a program that's as expensive as UBI, compared to another very expensive program, the Green New Deal's about the same cost as a UBI over a decade. And this is kind of a battle that we need to stick up for unconditionality and for cash.
I agree that I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that for me, when I say there's components of the Green New Deal that we can be supporting, I'm talking about the building of infrastructure, the supporting. I don't think that I don't consider that a federal jobs guarantee. I consider those to be the components that are important to us as a nation to actually making huge leaps forward that we need to combat climate change, right? To me, that is absolutely critical. The jobs guarantee part of it, like I said at the beginning, I have no confidence that there's even enough jobs out there in any kind of long term, even probably in a short term, to be able to provide a job for everybody. It's kind of a ridiculous notion. But I also think that, so I just want to be really clear when I'm saying that there's parts of the Green New Deal that we should be supporting, and that to me, what I wouldn't want to do is to pit Green New Deal against UBI. I think that's actually.
Oh, I want to though. I mean, so I think that's,
but like
Green New Deal, the infrastructure is the jobs though. I mean, I think that's like, if you just wanted to build infrastructure, you could do that without a job guarantee. But the job guarantee is absolutely, I mean, if you hear how they describe it compared to other green building programs, it is about the jobs. And it's often those same people who tend to oppose really much more effective policies like carbon pricing. I mean, if we really cared about the climate, we would just have a carbon dividend today. We could do that, and it wouldn't require any new infrastructure, because the infrastructure would build itself. We would set the market on the right course. So I think as UBI advocates, I really encourage people to support Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a grassroots group fighting for a carbon dividend. They have a bill in Congress with 80 plus members of Congress who are co-sponsors. I think we should do everything we can. Yeah, HR 763, that's right, Sarah. I see it in the chat. Yeah, I think we should also be promoting things like the Romney Child Allowance. There are intermediate bills that get us much closer to a UBI, but they're in real competition. I think we saw in the stimulus, I think, Stacey, you mentioned this on call a few weeks ago in the income movement, that there were some people who in general supported the idea of checks, but when push came to shove, they want to do more on the unemployment benefit side. So I think we need to fight for checks compared to the alternatives, and those alternatives can be job guarantees, they can be food stamp expansions, unemployment expansions. There are a lot of really promising paths forward for us to make the case.
Stacey, I'll let you respond, and then we'll need to move on because I know we have a few other topics to hit. But any last thoughts on the either or debate?
My internet cut in the middle, so I lost this last. That's why I wasn't on the screen anymore. So I don't want to respond to something that I don't know what just got said. So sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Let us move on to zoom out for a second. And I was curious to get your thoughts on what problem do you think we're trying to solve with basic income? I've heard arguments around, oh, well, this is poverty elimination. I've heard this is about recognition of work that people do that isn't currently valued in the traditional marketplace. I've heard, hey, this is just what you need to enable labor kind of liquidity in kind of fast changing industries, all kinds of goodness that comes out of basic income. But at the end of the day, in your view, Stacey, what is the point of basic income? Why do we need to do it? What are we trying to accomplish?
Well, I think that, I mean, everybody has a different opinion on this. I think that for me, I am attracted to basic income and fighting for it because I don't want for women and for children and for kind of the people who have been suffering the most for the longest period of time under our current economic system to continue to experience that. I mean, for me, it's a very humanist perspective. It is about dignity. It's about eliminating economic stress and precariousness from a large number of people in our population. I think the stories of what it actually means right now to be working at a minimum wage job or barely more than a minimum wage job in this country right now is kind of a devastating story. And I think that if people really paid attention to that story, I think that it would be made a larger priority by so many of us. And I mean, all of those other things, everything that you listed, Tom was like, yeah, check. The VI actually, does all of those things. But the thing that fuels my work is specifically just thinking about the people in our society who are completely thrown to the wayside in our economic system, and what that actually means day to day. I mean, I don't know if people understand that who haven't either lived it or had somebody very close to them living it. I used to be a teacher, and where 90% of my kids were on free and reduced lunch. We had the only food that those kids got every day was the free breakfast and free lunch. It's really, really common when you start to have conversations with those kids about what that experience is like. And when everybody's pulling together funds for families so that they can pay their bills, and parents know there's some kind of fund that the school has pulled together to be able to keep their lights on or their water, you know, running. Like those are some really basic things that, from my perspective, should not be managed and supported and relegated to the nonprofit sector, to GoFundMe's, to all of these different mechanisms right now that we have in place that are essentially wealth redistribution mechanisms, right? But it's like not taking money from the right places, from the right people, and helping support their community. It should be coming from the large pool of all of our resources. That's what our government is designed to do, is to make sure that we are all cared for, and that are, you know, at the most fundamental level. So for me, that's why I do the work that I do, period, is because I don't think that our system right now, our system just leaves far too many people behind. And the weight of that on the day-to-day existence of people is pretty significant and is heartbreaking.
Thank you, Stacy. Max?
Yeah, I'll be quick because I'm eager to hear the Q&A and all that. So this will be kind of a data geek answer, but I think I like to focus on the things that are measurable. So that's like the poverty rate, for example, because so many of these programs fail to reach the poorest people that we have today. UBI has a really incredible opportunity to relieve poverty, especially deep poverty. So for an example, Mitt Romney's child allowance bill, which I really encourage people to research and support, cuts deep child poverty by half. It cuts overall child poverty in a third. And you wouldn't have those kinds of results from really a pretty modest, I mean, it's $350 a month for kids under age 6, $250 a month for kids age 6 to 17. You wouldn't have those kind of results if our current programs weren't just failing. And don't get me wrong, they're important. Overall welfare programs cut poverty by about 2/3 compared to if you had just nothing. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So I think that's one. Inequality also, it does cut inequality pretty substantially, especially if it's funded. But that's also largely because most of the inequality has to do with low-income people not having very much, low-wealth people not having very much. And making sure you reach that bottom end is really important. I'd also mention marginal tax rates. I mean, this is kind of the conservative argument for UBI, but the fact that I've mentioned a few times, like we can level out the low-income marginal tax rates by a lot, ensure that people are paying fairly, being compensated fairly for the labor that they put in, regardless of where they are in the income spectrum. Making sure that parents can take care of their kids if they want to, the same opportunities that high-income parents have for one parent to stay at home. Low-income people don't have the opportunity. Things like how much time, this isn't as quantified yet, but I would hope to see it be quantified. How much time do we spend, or how much time do the low-income people spend complying with these programs, applying to them, and making sure that they can navigate the very complex bureaucracy that they have to do in order to stay out of poverty, thanks to the way we've designed these programs. These are all things that are very concrete, where we can compare it to the alternatives or to the status quo, and where UBI in general is very favorable.
All right, well, let's move on. Oh, go ahead, Stacy. A quick comment from you.
I was just gonna say, to add to what Max was just saying around, you know, the Romney child tax credit and some of the other components. The $1,200 stimulus check brought 8.8 million people out of poverty. $1,200 brought 8.8 million people out of poverty. Like, that's what we're talking about right now. That is how small incomes are for millions of people in our country. So yeah, I think I just wanted to reiterate how a very little amount of money can have such a massive impact right now, because of how devastating our poverty rates are, and just incomes of people that are living below the poverty line.
For sure. It is incredible how we can often overlook, those of us who are really fortunate, how many millions of people are in poverty in the wealthiest country in the world. And let me segue into how we make this a reality. Of course, a lot of us were very excited last year when there was this guy running for president, and it was a big plank of his campaign. He's now running for mayor of New York City, so many people will not receive benefits of basic income because of his efforts, at least not directly. And I'm curious, how are you thinking about this movement getting traction? Certainly there have been pilots and there's studies, but it still feels a little bit like on the, not quite in the mainstream of policy discussions. And would love to get your thoughts, Stacy, for starters, on how people can get involved and how can people make this happen and get out of the kind of discussion mode into actually seeing it on the ground.
So I think that when Income Movement thinks about how to build the movement that's necessary for basic income to become a federal legislation that gets passed, there's kind of three pillars to that. There's the political side, there's the grassroots side, and then there's kind of the thought leadership side. And all three of those really need to be working at the same time. And we need to be making solid progress on all three of those. And certainly, I think that Andrew Yang brought the idea of UBI back into the political discourse, and certainly COVID and the economic crisis that we find ourselves in has provided in many ways kind of the worst test case scenario for why direct cash transfers are critical. But I think that even when Andrew was running to be president, I think we all knew that it's really important to have somebody in the White House who supports it, but you also need a majority in Congress. And so when we think about how we actually get to a federal UBI, there's so many different components that need to be getting pushed on regularly. You have the grassroots. People need to be, speaking up. They need to be writing their letters to Congress right now in particular. They need to be being activists, getting out into the streets if safety and social distancing is allowed, ways to actually get press involved and understand that there's a large demand on the ground for this. Of course, the thing that's going to move the needle for most of our leadership is actually in the voting booths. And so understanding, doing your research on candidates, but not just federal candidates, all the way down ballot to mayors. I think, Mayors for Guaranteed Income is a really important coalition because it brings opportunity for us at the city level to start getting deeply involved in our local politics and influencing our local politicians. And certainly when you have a coalition like MGI that can then work together towards bringing the idea of guaranteed income up to governors and federal level. A lot of mayors, especially if it's of a larger city, have real influence and impact on representatives and senators. So thinking about things on those levels is really important. How are you voting? Who is running? Last year we saw a lot of people starting to run on UBI, and that was really exciting. I think more and more we're going to see a pretty wide variety of people running on UBI. In New York, it looks like Andrew's not going to be the only candidate who's supporting UBI or basic income. So I think that's going to happen more and more. When we have multiple people running in the same race who are supporting UBI, how are we as grassroots communities and voters going to make determinations on which candidates make the most sense that you want to be supporting, and being able to have a lot of the work that Max is doing at the UBI Center, Economic Security Project, Eat Humanity Forward. There's a lot of organizations that are diving into policy, legislation, and a lot of these things so that there can be models that we can be looking at to understand what is the strongest advocacy for UBI and what are the components that we want to see passed. There's a lot of really great stuff happening at the state level, and I'm sure California Yang Gang is fully aware of some of the stuff happening in your state. Here in Oregon, we have the Oregon People's Rebate, which is a ballot measure that's going to be up in 2022. That would be annual rebate that would go to every single person. It's kind of the most universal UBI really kind of piece of legislation that we've seen. Every single person who lives here at least 200 days out of the year would receive it. And so there's some really cool things that are happening, I think, at the local level all the way up. And I think if you're paying attention to those things, finding in your community opportunities to have conversations and also build coalitions to make sure that people who are running for office know that you value this, that you think it's important, that you ask organizations like Humanity First Movement, Yang Gang, all these other income movement. There's so many organizations who are helping support conversations around basic income to, one, grow the grassroots community, but also provide political leaders opportunities to talk about and talk with other UBI experts to understand the benefits of it. I think there's a lot that we can be doing right now to make it so that our voices are heard as grassroots, but also that we're having a deep impact on the local in the local spaces. And I think that we've been working with a wide variety of organizations specifically for COVID and legislation, stimulus legislation that's at bailoutthepeople.com. And those are just direct actions that you can take to try to get recurring cash payments, to get monthly stimulus checks right now in the next series of legislation. We feel pretty sure that we're not going to get it in the 1.9 trillion that is going through in the next couple of weeks, but there's a lot of work happening, a lot of lobbying happening on the Hill right now to get recurring stimulus checks in the recovery legislation that's going to be necessary. And I think we all recognize that that's pretty critical for recovery. That kind of regular, consistent income for a while could actually really deeply have a positive impact on local and state economies as well as the national economy. But so I think that there's a lot that we can be doing right now. It's actually, in some ways, it's probably the most high impact moment, like the next few months, or we can have a bigger impact than maybe we've been able to have even during the election cycle, I would say, because of how much interest and conversations there are around recurring stimulus checks. And if we can get multiple stimulus checks written into a piece of legislation, the data that's going to provide and the benefit that's going to provide immediately to people, but also for us to be able to make the case for why recurring cash is so critical in economic crisis and just in general, we can make a pretty solid case for and continue to do that work to get more and more people elected, more people feeling like they can run on it, and we can get that kind of that momentum that we've started to build to just increase over the next 2 to 3 election cycles so that we can get a majority in Congress to get it passed.
Thank you, Stacey. Max, what's your take? Do you agree the stimulus checks are the recurring stimulus is a vector into more basic income, or are you seeing action in these local trials? Where do you see the most traction to get progress?
Yeah, I think those are definitely both really important, as long as people are getting more, like the first recurring check that's nationwide, it doesn't matter how big it is, in my view, like that's going to make a huge difference. So I think stimulus checks are one route to that. Two others I I think are actually probably the most promising are a child allowance. So talked about Rodney's child allowance. I think that's really important because it goes through the Social Security Administration, unlike the existing child tax credit or the proposed Biden expansion of the child tax credit, which would be monthly. So that's going to give, it's going to make sure it goes truly universally, and then it's paid back on the back end for very high earners. So something that's truly universal among parents, I think, would make a huge dent. Also, it's fully funded, so it could actually become permanent law through budget reconciliation. That's not true of the Biden plan. It's not true of any other of like recurring checks, at least at this point. So I think that's really, really promising. Also, the Carbon Dividend Act, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that Citizens Climate Lobby is putting through, that would be extremely effective for climate change, of course. And also it would provide a monthly check to every person in the country, adults and children. And that could also be, I think, passed permanently through budget reconciliation because it's budget neutral, but it still affects the budget. So those two are really great. I think also Stacey's emphasis on the state level policy would be huge. We could do a child allowance at the state level that's probably more tenable than the UBI at the state level, just because it's going to be less expensive. And from a pure impact per dollar, giving money for children is going to have larger long-term consequences than giving it to adults, although I firmly believe in both. But I think if I had to choose, I would pick kids at this point. And it's also more likely to achieve bipartisan support because of Republican interest in families. So I think California could do something like that. California could do basically replacing our current cap and trade system, which gives people a credit on their energy bill every year. It's very opaque. It's not a dividend in any form, and it just doesn't work that well. I think we could improve upon that by having a carbon dividend in California. It didn't happen in Washington State when it was tried, but I think it could really, with more grassroots support, those kind of solutions are really promising. And then at the local level too, there are the mayors for guaranteed income. These pilots are a good step, but you could also have something like what San Francisco and New York City and Montgomery County, Maryland do, where they have a EITC match at the local level. It's not very generous in any of these three cases, but it is guaranteed universal cash, or unconditional cash, excuse me, for low-income people. It could be made better by including non-workers, for example, in San Francisco. So I think there's things in the direction of UBI that you can advocate at all levels of government.
Awesome. Well, let's get on to a couple of the questions that were picked up in the chat as we were talking, and then we are going to be wrapping up soon. But before we wrap up, I wanted to pick up on one question around the homeless population and individuals who may not have an address or a bank account. Any thoughts on how folks who are homeless would participate in a basic income and how we would support that?
Rashida Tlaib's ABC Act did a really good job of outlining what a mechanism, and this was for this was in response to COVID, as recurring cash payments, and they outlined similar to what Seed did, which is preloaded debit cards, and that Representative Tlaib's legislation specifically talked about the mechanism for distribution of those to be places like post offices and just kind of common places that everybody knows about, where you could go in and receive your debit card that would then every month just be reloaded with your dividend or stimulus payment, whichever you want to call it during these times, but just even in a permanent space. I think thinking about the unbanked, thinking about people who don't maybe take advantage of or haven't been able to be part of kind of our mainstream systems, whether that's addresses, whether that's banks, whether it's IDs, formal IDs. There's a lot of people out there that that we need to make sure that we're finding ways through that. And that, you know, when it comes to thinking about how to make sure the money goes to the people who it's designed to be for, I think that that's certainly one distribution method that could be highly effective.
Yeah, this is kind of a solved problem in the sense that the Social Security Administration, I was just looking up what they have, and they do have mechanisms for reaching people experiencing homelessness. As Stacy mentioned, like it can go on a debit card, it can go to people who they know, so they can direct it to them. Most of the people who are unbanked, it's not really, I mean, cost is a reason for some of them, but it's largely distrust of institutions. So there could be some things around just trust and education that could help there. So if Social Security can reach people experiencing homelessness, I think so can UBI. I also just want to mention that there was a study in Canada that it had a control group, and they gave cash transfers to people experiencing homelessness, and they ended up spending it a lot on their kids, and they spent less time homeless. So this really, maybe it's a problem that will kind of solve itself. We have to figure out how to get the UBI to people experiencing homelessness once, and then we come close to eradicating homelessness. I'm only kind of half joking. I think it's going to make a major dent.
Awesome. One last question that came out from the audience was, what's the right amount to shoot for? Is it 1,000? Is it 2,000? Is it whatever we can pass in Congress? You know, the pragmatist in me wants to just see something and then we can build on it. On the other hand, I appreciate that a few $100s a month may not be enough to kind of really get people out of poverty and have the impact we want. Stacy, you want any quick thoughts on the amount, and then we'll get Max's closing thoughts, and then hand it off to Sean for the outro.
Well, I think I'm very curious to see the seed results, because they're you know, many of the pilots have been $1,000 that have gone out. Seed was $500. And so I think that the precarious nature of where people find themselves economically right now, $500 would absolutely have an impact, a big positive impact. I mean, I think when we look at some of the data around people who received even, you know, smaller amounts, the breathing room that can create, the opportunity for being able to take a sick day, you know, those very basic things, actually $500 a month, I think could have a big impact. And it might need to be the lower amount, like you're saying, Tom, at the beginning, in order just to get it passed. And then being able to understand what that looks like, because the price tag is so significant. I think that the first legislation that is passed is not going to be universal basic income. I think it's going to be some targeted version, and what may not be as robust of a monthly payment as we would like. But yes, those are important, big stepping stones towards a more permanent UBI.
Thank you, Stacy. Max, what's the number? Is there a number where like you can actually start seeing impact? What's the minimum to kind of get things, you know, kind of rolling in terms of traction?
I think $1, honestly, like every dollar counts. So especially if we're thinking, I know this has mostly been about the US context, but there have been calls for UBI, or what actually Nobel laureates Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo have called a universal ultra basic income in developing countries. And they've literally called for $1 a day per person in India. And that would cut extreme poverty in more than half. I mean, the poverty line in India, or globally, the extreme poverty line is $2 a day. So If that's going to make a difference, there are a lot of people who live not on $2 a day. Basically, nobody lives at that level of extreme poverty in the U.S. But people on 1,000, 2,000 a year, you know, something like that. So having something like $100 a month or $50 a month would make a big difference. One kind of back of the envelope or statistic to keep in your head is a $300 per month UBI would pretty much cut poverty in half anywhere. So that's a really important starting point. $1,000 I think is a pretty good target. That's $12,000 a year. Our GDP per capita is 65,000. So if you start adding in the other costs that government needs to provide, you're getting pretty close to like the 40, 50% of GDP that we would have to collect in taxes. And that's comparable to other developed countries who would actually maybe be on the high side. So if you look at $2,000 a month, then you're probably exceeding 50% of GDP you're having to collect. So we're kind of in uncharted territory at that point, but we're so far from that. And the US is frankly so anti-tax that anything that's going to be funded, durable, and get money into people's pockets every month is a major victory.
Well, Max and Stacy, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening and really getting into a lot of the nuance. And I wish we had time to continue it. There were also a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but surely there will probably be another policy nerd session on basic income. But I wanted to thank you again for sharing your thoughts with us and hand it over to Sean for some closing remarks. Sean?
Yeah, and we would love to extend that gratitude to Tom. Thank you so much for being our wonderful moderator tonight. Everyone here, be sure to check out his YouTube channel, Nerds for Humanity, on YouTube. And regarding the UBI panels, yeah, we'll have another one on February 26th, themed about actually talking about UBI with your friends and family. So if you are already registered via Action Network, you'll hear more about that soon. And we'll be sure to have more UBI events in the future. This is the first of many Policy Nerd Nights events. You can get involved with the many links that have been shared in chat to Income Movement, UBI Center, and the California Yang Gang. We try to put together these events for everyone to get involved. So thank you everyone for attending, and I hope everyone has a great time and a great rest of your President's Day. So
Thanks, you guys. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Tom. Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Stacey.
Thank you guys. Bye.